Now, this is the adaptation session, and Aïda DIONGUE-NIANG is going to give us a presentation. She is a meteorologist and a climatologist from Senegal. She is part of the working group of the IPCC, vice president actually of that working group. So welcome, Aïda. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you've enjoyed your lunch. We're going to start the session on adaptation. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this presentation on the changes that have been observed in Africa, in changes that will come in the future. So I'm going to tell you about the IPCC results frequently. The IPCC is a UN organization that is in charge of assessing climate change, both in the scientific aspect as in the social and economic and technological aspects. As we reminded, this is the 6th cycle of the IPCC. Nadia showed us this morning the different reports of the cycle. So there are special reports, there are group reports, 1, 2, 3, and the summary report. I took part as an author in the first working group report, so the physical basis of climate change, but I'm going to talk about the conclusions mostly that come from the second working group in chapter 9 on Africa, which is a chapter that is dedicated to climate change and to the adaptation in Africa. So it's a very simple agenda for my presentation. I will tell you about the observed changes and the impact, and then I will talk about the changes and the future risks, and then conclusions and comments. So this is the 6th assessment report that show that there have already been impacts, losses, and damages that have been largely associated and substantially observed and attributed to climate change. It's shown in 4 categories here. So the first one is for the water availability and food production. Then there's one on health and well-being. Cities, settlements, and infrastructure. Biodiversity and ecosystems. So the red colors are for negative ones, and when it's in gray, or when it's diagonal lines rather, it's adverse and positive impacts. It's not assessed, and the points show the level of confidence with regards to the link, the causal link between these impacts and climate change. So when there are 3 dots, that means that there's a high confidence, 2 points from 50 to 60%, and low when there's only 1 dot. So if we want to look at this in more granularity, the next one, the next graph, shows us the changes in the same 3 categories. So water availability, food production, health and well-being, and then cities, settlements. This is to show you that climate change has had an impact on it's the people who have contributed less to climate change that suffer the most from it. And if we look at Africa, we see that there are only negative impacts at regional level. So the fact that there might be positive impacts here and there, overall in Africa and in the insular states, they are only negative impacts. So for the water availability, for instance, this is because half of humanity has faced at least a water scarcity, and in Africa it's more for southern and northern Africa that the starkest water scarcity levels are found. Agriculture, we'll get back to that. The negative impact is really linked to that. There's also impact on cattle raising. And also for fisheries. and so on.
Donc, pour montrer que ce sont les pays les plus vulnérables,
So to show that
vont montrer en fait,
these are the most vulnerable countries,
et les émissions
we can
de l'Afrique et des autres
see
pays.
Africa's emissions.
Donc, toujours dans le même ordre d'idée.
So still in the same vein, here we have a figure showing the vulnerability of the population and on the vertical axis. These are emissions per capita, CO2 emissions.
On montre que c'est les pays qui ont des
So countries that have the highest vulnerability level are also the ones that have the lowest CO2 emissions globally.
Maintenant, si on regarde les émissions,
Now, if we look
d'abord, on regarde la vulnérabilité, les facteurs de vulnérabilité, exposition.
at the vulnerability factors
En fait, ce qu'il faut
for
noter, c'est que quand on
exposition
parle
and to climate change. When we talk about impact or risk, of course, there are changes observed when it comes to physical parameters that overlap to the vulnerability factors for exposure and the answers that have been, the responses that are provided or not. So in Africa, the factors also include social and economic factors, political and environmental ones.
Si on prend l'emploi,
If we look at employment, for instance, we see that it's in sectors that directly or indirectly depend on climate, such as agriculture. Agriculture is mostly based on rain. There's very little irrigation, and there are more population infrastructure that are in areas that are exposed to climate weather events with a very fast rate of development. And there are areas that are really going to be impacted. We've seen that mortality is one of the results in climate change. And it's the countries that are the most vulnerable. There are 15 times more victims in case of extreme weather events in Africa than in other countries. Another vulnerability element in Africa, 600 million Africans don't have access to a clean energy source. So these are vulnerability sectors in Africa. And then, this is in line with what Nadia showed this morning. So these are the GHG emissions in Africa and throughout the world. So to the left, we have the emissions per capita for 2019 in green and 1990 in yellow. And we see that emissions per capita, Africans' emissions are very low compared to the rest of the world. If we compare these GHG, so it's CO2 equivalents, if we compare with Australia's emissions or North America's emissions, and even if we only looked at the least advanced countries in Africa, it's not even 2 CO2 equivalent of GHG. These are the trends between 1990 and 2019. This is for Africa in orange. So you see that it's very low compared to the rest of the world. So to get back to this impact, Africa, just like other areas in the world, has already suffered losses and damages, significant ones, and they are caused by climate change. So this includes that there's less food production, economic activity has slowed down, biodiversity is decreasing, and there's an increase in mortality and disease among humans. As for food safety, there's an improvement in the agricultural productivity overall, but in Africa, there's a 34% decrease since 1961 because of climate change. It's one of the conclusions of the report. In sub-Saharan Africa, from 1974 to 2008, corn yields have gone down by almost 6%, and elsewhere where there's wheat in northern Africa and Southern Africa, there's a 2.3% decrease in yields, and a survey has shown that 2/3 of Africans consider that climate conditions have worsened for agricultural production over the past 10 years. See the economic impact. What's important is to show that climate change has slowed down economic growth throughout the whole continent, and there's a difference between African countries and the other countries, temperate countries, such as northern countries. There's also the modeling studies have showed that there's a decrease of
Donc, avec comme corollaire le recul de la productivité, la réduction des performances.
Growth per inhabitant that has been of 13.6% on average. In Africa, we have a lot of data. In South Africa, we have a lot of data, so that's why the report results talk all about South Africa. So 80% of companies have lost more than half their staff and their turnover because they could no longer pay their staff. An impact on systems. We've already seen a decrease in marine biodiversity. We've also seen this in the west coast of Africa, a decrease in the productivity of lakes, including Lake Victoria. There's a change in the geographical area and the animal and vegetable species. Corals are being bleached, and there's also an impact on mangroves. For health, there's an impact on infectious diseases and also for non-transmittable diseases. And it's becoming more and more common in higher altitude areas. There's an increase in malaria because of floods. This is linked to climate change sometimes. And there's a cholera breakout following extreme weather events such as tropical cyclones in East Africa and Southern Africa. 43.8% of mortality is linked to heat. So that's in South Africa between 1991 and 2018.
C'est largement sous-estimé en Afrique parce qu'il y a eu des vagues de chaleur également dans la partie nord de l'Afrique.
There have been heat waves in northern Africa as well. Even recently, just a few days ago in the Sahel, they've reached 47 degrees in Mali, or even 48, so between Senegal and Niger. 100 people died, but often it's not counted properly, and it's actually, the figures are a lot higher. But there are heat waves. So the highest temperatures in this area are at the beginning of the spring. We're used to high temperatures such as 44, 45, but we've seen over the past few years that sometimes it's been 47, 46, and especially at night. Of course, there are damages linked to extreme weather events on healthcare centers. So all of these elements are linked to CIDs, so climate impacts, and also the vulnerability factors that I've mentioned before. The proper responses, so it can be heat. We've seen that throughout all Africa, there's an extreme temperature rise. There's droughts in Southern Africa, Northern Africa, Western Africa. And it's not only based on, it's also ecological droughts that are linked to the increase in temperatures because there's a lot of water evaporating. And this is very significant for Eastern Africa. We're losing our glaciers. We've shown that the increase in the sea water level is more significant in Africa than in other continents. And there are also problems in the coasts in several areas. So now I'm going to talk about future changes and risks. You have to understand that to talk about this, we use climate modeling. So it's scenarios that allow us to see projections and forecasts. It allows us to better understand causal links. We look at emissions and risks. How social and economic changes have an impact on emissions. Emissions depend on our way of life, our living conditions. In terms of emissions, here we've shown several scenarios used in the first working group. So it starts with very low emission scenarios, an intermediate scenario here, the trajectory on which we are, and so on. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to be quick. Climate is changing, and it's going to have an impact, and it comes with risks. So like I said, a risk is an interaction between changes, vulnerability, exposure, and responses. I'm not going to delve into details. It's a complicated table and chart, but it shows you our CIDs, so climatic impact drivers. For temperature, there are common changes. Changes are common to the whole of Africa, and everything to do with oceans and coastal areas. There are changes as well that are common for the whole of Africa. For heavy rains, there are changes everywhere, significant changes, except maybe in northern Africa and part of southern Africa. So this is what you see here as a map. So for yearly rains, this is as temperatures are going up. So these are changes. We see that changes are more significant as temperatures go up. So these are the future risks. Even with an intermediate increase, the loss in biodiversity, mortality, diseases, and decrease in food production. So the vertical bars are the transition from one category to another with the confidence degree, with their little dots there. We see that even at above 1.5 degrees, there are high risks, as you can see here, for these different categories. So significant risks are from 1.5 degrees, and at 2 degrees, risks are even higher. So that's an example that I've shown for the loss in biodiversity and ecosystems. Here again, I'm talking about the increase in the sea level. We're at 20 centimeters globally, but we've seen that populations exposed to these rising sea levels in the medium term in coastal areas in Africa. So what is worth noting here is that this is a baseline. We're at 54.2. These are scenarios in the increase of population. So that's the scenario with the strongest population increase. So we see that we will have no longer 54 million people exposed, but rather 116 million. This shows the countries that are among the top 25 most exposed ones. So there's Egypt, Nigeria, Senegal, that are exposed to extreme weather events, as you can see to the right as well. So the mortality risks linked to temperature in Africa, these are for different time periods, and for GHG, different GHG. So the first scenario, the intermediate one, the high emissions one, and even above 1.5 degrees. And for the period that we're going through right now, there are extra deaths linked to the increase in temperature for Northern Africa, most importantly. There are deaths that could have been avoided. And what we notice is that there are many deaths, and it increases as time goes by. And as temperatures increase. Other than dry heat, there's also steaming heat. So this is temperature as well as humidity. The number of days of exposure to a dangerous extreme heat measured by the heat index. African populations are exposed to deadly temperatures increase in the center of Africa and Western Africa. Africa is the continent that least contributes to greenhouse gases. Nonetheless, climate change has triggered negative impacts, losses and damages both in human systems and ecosystems, and has slowed down economic growth. These impacts are linked to changes in CIDs and climatic impact drivers, and that are going to increase as global warming increases. It requires immediate actions. We've seen that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees should reduce the damages caused to several businesses, agriculture. This is why we promote a transition that is as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. To conclude, the knowledge generation on these changes and impacts is necessary to implement strategies and adaptation measures. It is limited in Africa because we lack climate data. There are also sectoral and social and economic data that is missing. There's a lack of funding for research in Africa. It has been proven that there's only 3.8% of funding for research in Africa that is linked to climate change that goes to Africa. And the majority of these 3.8% funding goes to northern countries. So there's very little collaborative research at national or continental research. So research is mostly done by developed countries in Africa. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Aïda. We won't have time to cover everything. There's a question on heat waves. Unfortunately, it is very hard to hear the speaker.
Nous sont différents parce que ça se base sur la climatologie. Donc,
this is based on climate research. So if we look at Sahel, we're used to having high temperatures during the spring. We look at the temperatures, we look at a 30-year average, and we also look at the forecast to see how long these heat waves will last in time, and then there are warning systems that can be sent. So each region defines a heat wave based on climate data.
Comment est-ce que c'est décidé? On perçoit qu'à l'échelle de l'Europe, ce sont des régions qui sont plus petites, à l'échelle du continent africain. Elles sont très grandes, ces régions. Est-ce que c'est pertinent? Est-ce qu'on n'entend pas les incertitudes dans les régions si grandes?
Non, ça c'est une excellente question.
This is an excellent question because even in the Working Group 1, we've seen that the definition of regions is sometimes not very relevant, because if we look at Sahel, for instance, we don't find it in that definition because it is between Sahara. I was shocked to see that Dakar was within Sahara, according to this. So this can also be seen as a domination of developed countries because they are the ones who worked on with African people, but we reproduced the regions that were used for Cordex forecasts without even discussing this with the Africans in the working group. But we have big regions, but we really lack data in Africa, which doesn't allow us to have detailed assessment. So this work needs to be completed with regional and national research. There is a question on climate forecast.
Est-ce que ça pourrait être considéré comme un facteur positif du changement climatique dans ces régions?
L'augmentation des pluies, c'est vrai que j'ai pas eu le temps de le dire.
The increase in rainwater. I've not had time to do it. We see that it's a very green area, but it's based on its relative increases, so it's based on climate data. So if we have a region that is quite dry naturally, an increase in rain, even a small one, can seem huge because in terms of percentage. But it's worth noting that this increase is also done via an increase in extreme weather events. So these regions are going to have both droughts and extreme weather events. So it can be beneficial for water resources, but not so much so for risk management.
Oui, croisé, effectivement. C'est moi qui vous remercie.